Hi, welcome. I'm Walid Hezboun. I teach international relations here at the American University of Beirut. And I also, am I speaking to the mic? Try again? Okay. I'm Walid Hezboun, you heard that. I serve also as director of the CAMES, the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, which is the sponsor of this event. I want to point out that we're videotaping this event. Thus, during the discussion and afterwards, please speak into the microphones. Thank you. This video will be posted for public viewing on YouTube and accessible on the CAMES website. It's a tremendous honor to welcome Anthony Shadid back to AUB. He was awarded an honorary degree from AUB this year, and he's also previously served as writer-in-residence at the Islam Ferris Institute. And I think if you look at the archives of I think it's the Washington Post, he's also written about the history of AUB and a bit about the changing social community of Hamra. Anthony Shadid is currently Beirut bureau chief of the New York Times, but in recent months, as well as throughout his career as a journalist, he's traveled widely across the Arab region. And in his reporting, he's brought not only a fluency in Arabic, but also a powerful narrative skills as a writer, and been able to eloquently record the voices of Arabs during times of war and revolution. And I'm not alone in appreciating his writing. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes in 2004 and 2010 for his reporting in Iraq, and was a finalist in 2007 for his reporting from Lebanon around the 2006 war. He's also published 2 well-received books. The first, Legacy of the Prophet, Despots, Democrats, and the New Politics of Islam, which picked up on emerging trends within Islamist politics. And I think now we see that coming back in another phase. His second book, with the ominous title, Night Draws Near, Iraq's People in the Shadow of America's War, published in 2005, was based on his experience as an unembedded reporter covering the other side of the war in Iraq. He's nearing completion, I believe, on a third book about his family's ancestral village in southern Lebanon. And I would think that his recent experiences reporting across the region are giving him enough material for yet another book. But for now, I want to thank Anthony Shadid for agreeing to come to speak to us tonight. The title of his presentation is Imagining Otherwise, covering the Arab revolts from Tunisia to Bahrain. Please join me in welcoming him to AUB.
Thank you. I'm always told that I don't speak loud enough, so if anyone has trouble hearing, they don't hesitate to speak up. I'm happy to try to get closer to the microphone here. I want to just say thank you, first of all, to everyone here managing to come out in this weather. I know it's not the easiest track to get here, and it's very nice of everyone to come and join tonight. And I wanted to also thank Walid Hezboun and the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies for making this possible. It's been a pleasure getting to know Walid, and I always have to say I find it one of my favorite things is to come to AUB. As he said, I've had an experience here with Rami Khouri, a very incredibly rewarding experience, and I do feel an attachment, even though I wasn't a student here, I do feel an attachment not only to the university, I think, but also living in the neighborhood, as my wife and I do. If you feel part of the community, and I think what that community represents, and it's something that I think is very important for us to hold on to in the Arab world and the Middle East these days. I also want to thank my wife and my son. I thought they were going to be here, but they may not have made it here yet. My wife is both of course, my wife and my colleague. She's a remarkably courageous and admirable journalist, and I feel lucky to be a part of her life. And also my son, Malik, I have to say, he's a year and a half, and he's already learned to raise his fist at every YouTube video of protests going on anywhere in the Arab world. So he's learned to raise his fist before he's learned how to speak, which I think is a good sign of where he's headed in life. I have to say, my predictions so far this year, that Mubarak would stay in power, that the battle for Tripoli would last weeks, that the Obama administration's call for Bashar al-Assad to step down would matter. Of course, I was wrong on all counts. And what I've learned over this year, I think, is that the most powerful journalism describes and witnesses rather than lectures and harangues. And that's what I was going to try to do tonight, if I could. I wanted to try to take you all through what I've seen this year in hopes of trying to make sense of it. I think it's too early to really make sense of it, but at least maybe get a sense of where we're headed or where we could head. And I thought I'd start with the prison cell that I found myself in March. Now, I suppose there are worse prison cells out there. I certainly have seen them in Baghdad in particular. This one was even painted a kind of soothing yellow. But my colleagues and I were handcuffed, and we were left in the basement on a few ratty mattresses with a bottle to urinate in, a jug of water, and a bag of dates that seemed like they'd been there for several weeks. When I think back, I remember the graffiti that was etched into the walls of this prison cell. God bring us relief, one line read. Next to it was a more intimate aside to an earthly shelter, my beloved Firdaus. In hindsight, the worst was already over when we found ourselves in this prison cell. In a town in Libya whose name I hadn't bothered to really learn until that month, soldiers for a government that was crumbling, but still, back then, remarkably resilient, had taken us captive at a makeshift checkpoint. Bullets had flown around us. I remember the soft dirt was popping with their impacts. I had run and then I stumbled on a sand berm. If I think back, I feel like I can recall every muscle in my body taut as it braced for where the gunfire would strike. I don't know if people here have read George Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia. It's one of the great examples of, I hate to use this phrase, but great examples of war reporting. And George Orwell has a line in that book about going over the barricade, and he said it wasn't the fear of getting shot, it was the fear of where the bullet would strike. And for the first time, I actually learned that, and I understood what he meant in describing that kind of feeling. A few moments later, my colleagues and I were on our knees next to a simple one-room house where a woman clutched her infant child. She was crying uncontrollably before that terror that war brings. Soldiers trained their guns on us. Just lost my speech there. Soldiers trained their guns on us. They beat us. They stripped us of everything in our pockets, and they forced us on our knees. One of them, slightly taller than the others, surged toward me. "You're the translator," he screamed to my incomprehension. "You're the spy." A few seconds passed, and another soldier approached. His eyes were flared in rage, and I'm sure some of us have seen that here. They were sealed in that sheen that comes from a lack of reason. He demanded that we lay on our stomachs, our faces in the dirt, and it was a position that I thought augured at that moment our execution. "Shoot them," he said calmly. As I sat in that cell the next day in Sirte, Colonel Gaddafi's hometown, I realized there was something about the moment, about the tall soldier's words that I remembered. I recalled it in Ramallah all those years ago in 2002 when I lay under a cemetery gray sky waiting to die from a bullet wound in my back after I was shot by an Israeli soldier. There's nothing exhilarating, I have to say, about escaping death. Its very prospect is like poison. It spreads through the vessels of your body. It lingers far longer than the bruises do, of course. And it lasts long after the memories fade of hands and legs bound by wire, those scenes so familiar to me over so many years in Baghdad and all those other cauterized cities in Iraq. It was still there even after the words of a deranged leader, house to house, Zenga Zenga, were set to a song that seemed as ludicrous as the era he incarnated. Surviving death is not a moment, I guess, but maybe a passage. After a day in this yellow jail cell that I described in Sirte, we were transferred to a military airport where the beatings were worst. Blindfolded and bound with plastic handcuffs, I was hit by the butt of a gun to the head. I staggered and waited for the next blow and the next and wondered how many there were going to be. And as I sat on the plane that took us to the capital, Tripoli, I panicked even more as the restraints dug into my wrist and numbed my swollen hands. I'm a writer, of course, and all I could think about was that I would lose my means of work. When a man approached me, hearing my cries for help over the drone of a cargo plane, I turned my head, waiting for another fist to land. I couldn't see his face, but as he leaned toward me, I could feel his breath on my ear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. More time passed in Tripoli. I forget the day now, I have to say, but eventually we were taken to the lavish offices of the foreign ministry there. An urbane official there chatted with us in a small talk that I thought suggested embarrassment. I forgot everything he said save a few words he quoted to me, or quoted to my colleague rather, in idiomatic British English. They were 2 lines from a poem by William Butler Yeats. "Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love." I have to say, at that moment, and even until today, I hated him. I hated the billboards that I saw as I left the country after that week of captivity in Libya. escorted by Turkish diplomats who helped get us out of there. There was the propaganda of a regime that did not deserve to be mourned. 41 years of permanent joy, read one slogan superimposed over a sunburst. Democracy is popular rule, not popular expression, read another. And to this day, I have no idea what that latter slogan meant. I hated what all these years had done to the Middle East where I live and work, turning it into the scene of misery and trauma. And I knew at that moment that we got released from Tripoli, that it was all over, all of it. The Arab world, I think, is never going to be the same. And like I said, there's not much I can say with certainty these days. My predictions do turn out to be wrong. But that I can. This year I've had the incredible luck to visit most of it, Lebanon, Bahrain, Syria, Egypt, and of course Libya, again just a couple of months ago. I can't tell you what's going to emerge. Anyone who does is probably lying to you. But I do know that something powerful has shifted. And while the path ahead may be bloody, indeed it already has been, I remain an optimist. And after all the years I spent covering Iraq, along with wars in Lebanon and Palestine, optimism is something I didn't have until this year. And I still have it even today, even now, even after the wretchedness of Colonel Gaddafi's execution, the terrifying sectarianism that I see in Egypt and Lebanon, and the bloodiness of the most important revolt of all of them in Syria. What lays before us is both, I think, if I can be so bold, is both a challenge and an ambition. It's the prospect of community. It's how we define ourselves, see ourselves, understand ourselves, and on that basis, join with others. And I have to start in talking about this where it always seems to begin in the Middle East for so many years, and that's Egypt. I was in Egypt in my 20s. It was actually my first job as a foreign correspondent. I was a student there, and then I came back as a young reporter. Often I have to say, as much as I love Beirut, I was living there now in my 40s. And when I got there this January, the place was writhing underneath decade upon decade of crushing bureaucracy and a despotic government that never treated its people as well as it did the foreigners who came to visit there. The revolution had started by the time I got there. It was an uprising, it felt to me at least, of the dispossessed. If dispossessed is the word that captures all the petty humiliations and bribes and miseries and abbreviated lives that should have been lived differently. The revolution, though, was more than a rebellion. And at the risk of sounding cheesy, and I have to catch myself sometimes when I speak about that moment in Tahrir Square, it felt to me like it was imagination. And the place where that imagination, as I just mentioned, was Tahrir Square, that sprawling downtown, I'm sure a lot of people know it, downtown roundabout in Cairo that's so familiar to us. I was there a few days before Mubarak finally fell, and already I felt this revolution in spirit had occurred, even if a dictator would remain in power for a few more days. I never understood why my editors would never let me use the translation of the word, liberation. The English felt so fitting to me in the articles I was writing back then. And I was thinking of its meaning as I walked to the square with a guy named Ahmed Abdelmanem. He was draped in a blanket. It was still cold in those days. And he felt free to talk as we crossed the Asad Anil Bridge to the site where an around-the-clock protest, as we all remember, had convened. And I remember his words well. My vision, he told me, grinning, goes a lot farther than what my eyes can see. That day, cries of rebellion had reverberated through the teeming square, a space encircled by old monuments to a withering authoritarianism. Welcome to a free Egypt, men and women had chanted with determination. And by nightfall, when we arrived, the scene had grown more subdued as the cheers and cries gave way, and the square became a stage for impromptu poetry readings, performances, and continuing political debates. Ahmed spoke again. What I see here, he turned to the square, is what I've never seen in my life. And I remember his grin turned to a smile. Everyone here is awake. Here's what that community on that night looked like. Canteens prepared cheese sandwiches and no one had to pay. Volunteers ferried tea to weary guards at the barricades. Pharmacies gave out bandages and lotion, disinfectant inhalers, intravenous solution, and even insulin. Artists brought their aesthetic to the asphalt in the square there, rendering work that I have to say was perhaps more inspired than memorable. But as the night unfolded, vendors ambled through these peaceful streets. They moved past couples holding hands and men still wearing bandages from their fights with thuggish government supporters who had dared to attempt to suppress their vision of a new home. And And I knew then that a people would once, in my years back in the 1990s when I was a reporter there, who had complained for so long about their own quiescence, would no longer stay quiet. O Time, Take a Picture of Us went a song by Abd Halim Hafez that night that was blaring from the speakers. We will grow even closer to each other, and whoever drifts away from the square will never appear in the picture. As I walked on, I chatted with a doctor. She was a beautiful woman who had come home to live this moment, this imagined place that had become a community. They will adore this square, she told me near a line of tanks, one of them bearing the graffiti of a protester, Egypt is mine. We'll clean the square, we'll cherish the square. It will be a symbol of making something new. I finally went back to my hotel room at a little past 5 a.m. I remember dawn's glow was filtering across the sky, and the call to prayer rang out. Prayer is better than sleep, the muezzin nearest to me declared. Some men and women in the square began to awaken as the call rose across a capital known as the City of a Thousand Minarets. And I walked with another guy. I remember his name was Mohammed Farouk. We went toward the entrance of the Asad Anil Bridge. And the bridge, I felt at that moment, was a border to a city that on any day staggers. It's 18 million people joined by millions from the countryside. Mohammed looked out at the gathering tumult, then he would look back behind his shoulder. And I'll never forget his words. They've taken on more meaning in all the difficult months, I think, that have followed since those days. You feel like this is the society you want to live in, he said, and he gestured back to the square. As I said, Muhammad's words have lingered with me, and obviously so has that scene in Tahrir Square. What has struck me covering the Arab world this year are these notions of imagination and community that persist even amid all the tumult and turmoil. In a lot of ways, those ideas and the way they're playing out today, I think, go back a century. I think to the very moments that helped define the Arab world. And what's so striking about covering these events is the way that time so often to me seems conflated, that past and present feel so intertwined, intersecting each day. Now, as most of us know here, and I'm probably going to be going over a lot of ground that you all have studied and more importantly lived, but the drawing of 20th century borders in the Middle East and beyond rendered traumas large and small. Sectarian and ethnic cleansing after World War I rid Turkey and Greece of much of their diversity. The horrors of nationalism and the Holocaust made Salonika, a celebrated melting pot, unrecognizable in its modern incarnation. Borders were drawn through Syria, Transjordan, Palestine, Iraq, and of course Lebanon with this imperial whim and arrogance. You look at any map and we all know how probably straight those borders are. The frontier between Lebanon and Palestine was actually drawn by two officers, not all that senior, who planted stakes as they ambled along on horseback. Even history's footnotes were rewritten. One of those places permanently affected is Marjayoun. It's a picturesque, if faded locale not too far from the Litani River, as a lot of us know here. It's my family's ancestral hometown, nestled near the Israeli and Syrian borders, and it's a little more than an afterthought these days on most maps that you look at. No one in this town, or this country for that matter, would necessarily long for the days of its Ottoman rulers more than a century ago. Before these new borders were drawn, massacres occurred, and Jews and Christians were faced with discrimination in taxes and commerce. There was no such thing as equality. To this day, the darkest moment of Marjayoun and Lebanon's history itself remains those last breaths of the empire, the Sefer Berlik. It was the Ottoman name for the draft, but it came to represent the famine, the starvation, the death that World War I brought to the region. One story will always linger with me, I suppose. An old man of the town once told me that the famished would have to search through the manure of animals, searching for an undigested morsel of grain. No one mourned the passing of the Ottomans then. Yet more than a few in Marjayoun, I think, might express a nostalgia for the time and the place that the Ottoman Empire represented when traders from this town, from Marjayoun, ventured to Arish on the coast of the Sinai Peninsula and down the Nile to a rugged Sudan by way of Palestine. It was a way station on the route from the breadbasket of the Haran in southern Syria to Akko, the Levant's greatest port on the coast of Palestine. Beirut, actually, to this town was an afterthought. Its traders rather plied the steppe of the Haran, its gentry owned land in the Hula Valley, and its educated ventured to Haifa and Jerusalem to make reputations. World War I and all the borders, obviously, that followed augured this town's demise. I've always thought that the ideologies that gained prevalence those days were about contesting those new frontiers: Arab nationalism, pan-Syrian nationalism, communism, it's self-imagining a broader community. They failed as more borders were drawn in wars with Israel in 48 and 67. With those lines on the map, I think came a smaller sense of self. By the time of Lebanon's civil war in 75, ideologies had given way to identities, and most in Marjayoun, and again, I think we can draw this lesson elsewhere, identifying themselves simply as Christian or perhaps Greek Orthodox, too unique to survive. A town of thousands is today a town of hundreds, strewn with the abandoned villas of another age. My grandmother's among them. There's no longer really a community there, nor is there much imagination. Hajr Bela Bashar, a friend once told me, stones without people. I've always felt these smaller identities, all that baggage of sect, of ethnicity, of memory, and so on, has made it easier for strong men to rule. Today remains my biggest fear in the face of my optimism. This town that I've been talking about, a backwater now, shamed by its present, is its example writ small. The more divided the Arab world is, the more pliable it becomes, and we're left with very little imagination. We're left playing by the rules of dictators, even when the dictators are gone. Excuse me. One way, I think, of understanding all the tumult these days is in the framework of these borders, of communities and identities. Across the region, I think the Arab Revolution has inspired a rethinking of identity, even as the older notions of self hang like a specter over the revolt's success. In its most pristine, and I say pristine, that rethinking feels transnational, as demands of justice, freedom, and dignity are expressed in what I like to think of as a rooted globalism, an indigenous vocabulary that finds a wider currency through technology. That vocabulary crosses those old borders, both physical and mental, the kind that deprived the region so long of imagination. From the first day that protesters seized Tahrir Square, the youth declared that they would reinterpret a notion of citizenship long reduced to a rhetorical exercise in the region. They cleaned streets, they ran their own security, and I have to say it was refreshingly polite. They organized health clinics. They even ensured that women would be protected from the harassment they endured at the hands of government-backed thugs anytime a crowd would emerge in Cairo before the revolution. Taken together, the square represented, I think, a model of people seizing the initiative from a hapless government. Empowerment was the more facile description, as youth knit together communities through Twitter, Facebook, and email, the story we've heard so often. But I think the protests drew on a deeper sense of dignity for people who often said they felt like strangers in their own country. And here's the way one of the organizers, a guy named Wael Khalil, put it to me. We've discovered ourselves, he said. As revelatory, I think, was a new form of politics, and this is what is probably most familiar to us today as we watch the Arab revolts unfold. For years, the Arab street obviously was an object of derision as crowds were turned out at the whim of dictators in Syria and Iraq, or deployed by the sheer organizational skills of Islamist movements, and I should note Hezbollah here. Egypt's revolt was by no means spontaneous. It was propelled by new media like Twitter and the potency of Al Jazeera's broadcasts. But the spark of Tunisia's uprising became the flame of Egypt's revolt. For the first time since I can remember, popular demands were delivered en masse in the Arab world. And I think Tunisia taught us, again, that the street can deliver. Even the slogan that people want to follow the regime was borrowed from, of course, from those Tunisian protests. So was the idea. Islam is the solution, goes the hackneyed slogan of Islamist activists that we all know so well. But protesters in Cairo in those days offered an alternative. Tunisia is the solution. And what it articulated was an indigenous vocabulary, free of the baggage of an American invasion or the condescension of the West, that put forth resonant calls in the street for an end to corruption, a better standard of living, the respect of rulers, and of course, a notion of dignity. People spoke for themselves, and they did it together. Since then, it struck me the way that youth across the region have driven the revolts by melding these two ideas, mass protests and a new language. Their vocabulary no longer hews to borders either. Leave, that slogan in Cairo, is skipped from Egypt to Yemen and Bahrain. There in the streets of the town of Sitra, strewn with rocks from nightly clashes that go on even today. Protesters have made it plural. Not only the king must go, but his family as well. Walls there also read peaceful, recalling the equivalent that I saw in Syria several months ago, Residents there have imported the Egyptian term Beltagia to describe state-sponsored thugs they face. In Syria, in those days after Colonel Muammar Gaddafi fell, in Libya, opposition activists in Syria said they were inspired by the hero of a bygone Libyan revolt, Armo Mukhtar. And I'd like to offer one other idea here in addition to these themes of a new vocabulary and mass protest, and it's about liberation. And what I've begun to understand is that liberation is as personal as it is political. People, in other words, are willing to fight. They're inspired by each other, from Egypt to Yemen. They're keenly aware of, I think this is important, of not only how people perceive them, but how they portray themselves. That goes even from the most ardent of Salafists. Take the group in Cairo that goes by the name Costa Salafists, named for their favorite cafe. And most of all, they're not giving up in any of the places that I've mentioned. In July, a few months ago now, I traveled along with a photographer, a very good man named Moises Saman, to Wadi Khalid, the border town here in Lebanon. Of course, like I said, it's on the border where armed Islamist smugglers and Syrian rebels mix freely. And we were headed on that day to Syria. The trip had taken us days to organize as contacts called contacts, no one giving their real name. Since we had no visas, they would have to ferry us across a porous border woven by roads, motorcycle paths, and foot trails. A young man named Ayad, a Syrian activist, met us there in Wadi Khalid with another friend named Ahmed, who himself had hailed from a family of smugglers. Ayad had a beard favored by religious conservatives and I thought a quick wit and a youthful smile. Until a few days before, he had worn his hair very long. Then security forces started asking about the guy with the long hair in his town, and he promptly cut it. And as we sat in this house rented by Syrian refugees, he and Ahmed outlined our passage. They would suss out a route that somehow, some way, would skirt a lot of checkpoints and even more soldiers. When asked if it was safe, he replied, "God willing." And I have to say, of course, the phrase in Arabic is reflexive, but translated never was quite all that reassuring. They called us Zingo and Ringo, and they were nicknames taken from an old Syrian cartoon. And together we rode on Suzuki motorcycles through the mountainous terrain over a 20-foot-high dirt berm that marks the border here, then along a long plain traversed by other smugglers carrying contraband fuel, cigarettes, anything else basically that can wrangle a profit. Every so often we shed more of our belongings, first our computers and equipment, deemed too suspicious, then our backpacks, which were deemed too foreign-looking, then our clothes and toiletries, which were deemed too cumbersome. And at the first safe house across the border, it was just a simple one-story affair where Ahmed lived. I was left with pretty much 3 notebooks and a pen. Everyone had grown nervous, even Ahmed, and Ahmed had made this trip a lot. But as we sat on these plastic mats on the floor sharing soft drinks, tea, and coffee, the conversation seemed to put us all at ease. And I realized that after all these months covering the Syrian uprising, this was the first time I had actually talked to one of those protesters in person. With visas so rare and only granted with conditions, most journalists have had to cover Syria by phone. And the calls really never last all that long. By day, a measure, this is back in July, by day a measure of normal life had unfolded in Homs, the hometown of these guys. Stores and government offices were open and people went about their business. Checkpoints had proliferated and the most active youth, people like Ayad and Ahmed, had tried to stay off the streets. They were worried that they were easier to identify by the daylight. By night they gathered in scores, sometimes hundreds in open defiance of the mukhabarat. In Ayad's living room, they bragged about spreading nails in the streets to flatten the tires of the vehicles of security forces. They described to me how they load onions into plastic pipes and fire them by igniting hairspray. When security forces surged toward one of their comrades, they shouted to him, "You've got 20 guys around you, blow yourself up." He really didn't have any explosives, but the security forces thought he did, and they ran away. Until this trip, I had never understood how Syrians keep fighting in the face of withering violence. How these laptops and cell phones and bags of nails and pipes and a lot more dangerous weapons these days made for a match for one of the Arab world's most fearsome police states. In talking to them, I realized they had reached the point of no return. Tunisia won, Egypt won, and we're going to win ourselves, one of them said when I asked him about the odds that he and the others were up against. There's no going back. To me, that was the definition of courage. They had come too far to stop. What I realized is that they had liberated themselves already. It was afternoon, and he and Ahmed wanted us to move before too much time passed as we made our way further into the country. We were due at another safe house, and their friends were expecting us. As we prepared to leave, Ayad turned to me and said words that I'll never forget. I say that often, but I mean it here. We've already won. We're victorious now. I lived a life of terror, fear, and killing, and now I'm free. In the end, I paid the price, and now I'm free. I'm free. Prior to the uprising, Ayad's life, by his own recollection, had been boring, even suffocating. He was a graduate of business and economics, but he had found jobs scarce. His family, though, was well off, and so he wasn't really in need of anything. The incentive to revolt, I think, was more ambiguous. He had just pretty much had enough of the humiliations, the unfairness, the propaganda, the hypocrisy, and now finally he could do something about it. No one encouraged him to go down to that first protest in Homs at the Khalid bin Walid Mosque, and no one had to. This is what he said next. In the end, I'm a person now. I can say what I want. I love you if I want to love you. I hate you if I want to hate you. I can denounce your beliefs or I can support them. I can agree with your position or disagree with it. But I'm a person now. We're not waiting to live our lives until after the fall of the regime. We started living them the first day of the protests. What Ayad told me, in other words, was the same thing that I had heard in Tahrir Square months before. He had imagined otherwise, and he was liberated. As we all know, his country, though, is not yet liberated, not in the sense of a dictator's fall or a coup vanquishing the family or a rebel army entering Damascus. Syria and much of the Arab world, I think, is still subsumed in that logic of fear, which forces once diverse societies to hew to their smaller parts. That obliterates, I think, the ability to imagine broader communities and other identities that multiply or overlap or contradict or intersect. Beyond a set of principles or promises so vague as to inspire more fear, I don't think anyone has really described the Arab world of tomorrow. Not yet, at least. Certainly not Bashar al-Assad, who offers his people a path back to the 1980s when a stern government presided over a dreary economy and the grimace of a police state. But the Syrian opposition hasn't really either. And that lack of vision has left frightened minorities more aligned with the government. The Egyptian military hasn't. It seems bent on preserving its 60-year-old privileges and, at least now, appears willing to risk the promises of Tahrir Square to guarantee it. Neither has the Nahda party in Tunisia, which still speaks of minorities in a language that evokes Islam's true tolerance of diversity through history. But in this century, it smacks of condescension. Minorities are asking for equality, not for benevolent protection. Finally, the minorities themselves, and I mean Christians here, have yet to face the future. Other than a few brave and noteworthy examples, we lack leaders that can articulate an identity beyond religion to the broader community of Christians and Muslims. We're not part of the debates that would define the region's new body politic, and we feel estranged from the identities that would underline the coming orders. The trend of minorities in Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere, whatever their ideological bent, is to coalesce into parties that press their demands simply as minorities, to persist in the smallest of identities, organizing ourselves by faith and not citizenship. We face a long autumn before our eventual demise. I think there may someday be a vision for the Middle East that draws on its past, before all these borders were demarcated across our lands and through our minds, when ancient trajectories of that Ottoman Empire I mentioned earlier stitched together a landscape that often embraced its many identities. I think there's probably a future in which loyalties are less to the state and more to those antique metropoles like Aleppo or Tripoli or Beirut or Mosul. They, of course, often answer questions of community better than the contrived countries that absorb them. The term might be post-Ottoman, where borders that never made all that much sense share a domain that remains connected from Cairo to Istanbul, Meydan to Basra, and Marjayoun, of course, to Arish. In that domain, I think there may be the prospect of people imagining themselves not as Alawite, or there may be the prospect of people imagining themselves as Alawite, Levantine, Arab, Syrian, Eastern, or some hybrid that transcends them all. But none of that is possible until the smallest identities are protected. And this is my greatest hope of the Arab revolts, of all the uprisings that we've seen this year. This is the revolt's promise. A Tunisian Islamist named Saeed Farjani told me a few weeks ago that such safeguards and guarantees would require what he called a charismatic state that would evolve in places like Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, and any other locale that was swept by the winds of change. It was the antithesis to all those eternal leaders presiding over imperiums with hollow slogans and manipulating society's components with cynicism that's portrayed as principle. It was the alternative, of course, to Zenga Zenga. A charismatic state can mend itself, reform, adapt, and heal when it failed in its fundamental task, and that's delivering the rights and duties of citizenship. And only in citizenship, he told me, could diversity be preserved and protected. Citizenship, he seemed to suggest, would permit us to become greater than our parts. It would allow us to imagine, and imagination is what I've had the chance to see in Sitra and Homs and Hama and Cairo and those Libyan towns like Darna, Beida, and Zintan. The vision in those places, of course, has yet to be realized, but in the imagination they represent, I hope, is eventually the community that's going to bind us together. Thank you. So Walid said that we could do some questions if anyone's interested. I know it's a rainy night, so I'll try to keep it all too long, but I'm happy to have a conversation about anything that's on anyone's mind.
I just wanted to ask what do you think about, the international community's pressures towards effectuating change in Syria. One point is that no one agrees with what the regime is doing. However, where does the line of sovereign state comes into play, and how does the change does not preserves the idea of democracy without instead bringing back the colonial powers back into another dissimulated liberal form into the Middle East?
Yeah. My experience, and I don't want to claim that I'm right. This is just my perspective on things, and of course there are grades of intervention, but I think direct intervention is never right. I just don't see it as ever being right. And I have that experience of Iraq, and I had to live in Iraq for 6 years, seeing the very fabric of a society torn to shreds because of intervention in Iraq. And people can make statements about what Iraq looks like today, but that society is traumatized, and it's going to be traumatized for a generation, I think, and it deserved better than that. I think Libya's revolution has an asterisk to it because of intervention there. I wish perhaps it could not have won out in the short term, but I think it would have in the long term. And I think there's going to be I think that country's going to have to reconcile itself with the debt that it owes the West in terms of that intervention. Hopefully it'll turn out better than it could. I don't know the answer or not. I think there are grades, though, of intervention that stop short of armed intervention that, I don't find objectionable as much. That's only my own sense of it. I'm sure people here are political scientists that can answer this question far better than I, but I don't think we've reached that point in Syria right now. I think it is dangerous with these calls for Turkish intervention, for no-fly zones. That's my own feeling on what it does to a country's ownership of what these revolts and revolutions represent. And I think that's a very powerful idea because there's powerful legitimacy within that. Now, I should just add real quickly here that I don't think Libyans do see it as having an asterisk. I think Libyans do see their revolution as a revolution. And they would disagree with me on that point there, but it is something that worries me as we go down the road. And and I think just if I can add one very minor point, if you look at Libya right now, if you go to Tripoli, how everyone was armed in that country over 6 months is disastrous. And I think we're going to have to reckon with the legacy of pretty much the most dangerous thing in the world, which is young men with guns.
You said at the start that did not allow you to use the word liberation. Do you regret not being able to use that? Do you think they were justified in not allowing you to use it?
I think, I don't think it was. It irritated me endlessly, but I think it was it's just a stylistic quirk, that they felt like they had to use that they didn't want to translate the Arabic to English. I think they do in other cases. I'm not really sure what the rule was, but it came down pretty early. I regretted it. My first story when I arrived there is I went to the square, and the square was free. And it was an incredibly beautiful moment. I think my lead was something like, on this day, Liberation Square was liberated. And that was the last time I was able to use the word. I think the edict came down from above soon after. But I do think it's a stylistic thing. My own feeling on this is the more you translate those terms, the less exotic they become, and it becomes more, meaningful to your readers. But that, it's not an argument I'm going to win. Let's see if there's any.
Lebanon being right next door and having a history of being intervened with on multiple levels and multiple times. What are your feelings about how the events in Syria are going to affect here? You live here. What's your feeling right now for things here?
It's kind of a prolonged state of anticipation in Lebanon to see what happens in Syria. I don't think there's any question that Syria is going to have a huge impact. However it turns out in Syria, it's going to have a huge impact on Lebanon. I do worry about the short-sightedness of the parties in Lebanon. I think there was a moment here as the revolt in Syria gathered force where there could have been more outreach. I think Hezbollah could have reached out more to the Sunni community. I think the Sunni community could have been less triumphant about the events that are happening across the border. I feel like the situation is worse in terms of its potential today than it was, say, at the beginning, but I feel like anything's imminent. But I think that, if there's one rule of Lebanese politics here is that Syria is going to reverberate across pretty much everything that goes on here.
To continue on the Syrian note, how serious is the international community on the whole taking the suspension from the Arab League, considering the Arab League couldn't even meet in 2008 over the Palestinian bombing of Gaza?
Well, my own sense.
People here in the front, whether they can answer this probably better than I can. My own sense of just talking to people is there's just that the United States, I was speaking to some European diplomats recently, same thing I've heard from Turkish diplomats, there's a sense out there that they have no leverage. And I think what we're seeing with Turkey's actions in Syria, the arming, or let's not say arming, but the granting refuge to the Free Syrian Army, this threat of sanctions, this refusal of Erdogan to rule out intervention, armed intervention, is a way of trying to get leverage in the conflict in Syria at this point. They know that if they put the sanctions on, they're going to lose that as a lever, as a point of leverage. So I think that's the reluctance to do it now. So I think when you're seeing so much focus on the Arab League in some ways is just it's a testament to the lack of influence elsewhere. Now, I think a lot of people they look at what happened in Libya with the Arab League and wonder if this isn't being set up again. I don't see it that way necessarily. I really see a lot of these powers as just kind of abdicating because they don't know what they can do beyond sanctions at this point. And there really isn't. I would be stunned if Turkey intervened in Syria. And it's just not going to happen with Europe and the United States.
This decision was like a precursor to asking for it.
Even if it was asked, nobody's going to do it. I mean, the Americans certainly aren't. It's just not even in the cards. It really isn't. And the Europeans aren't going to do it. So it's hard for me. I mean, maybe Turkey is something that, Turkey, it's a visceral fear in Turkey, this conflict. I was speaking to the Turkish foreign minister a couple of months ago, and I said, what is your biggest worry? And he said, it's civil war in Syria. It obsesses Turkish officials right now. They're worried about the Kurds. They think the Syrian government is playing the Kurdish card in the southeast. And they also worry about refugees coming across the border. And obviously, those refugees have become a permanent fixture in some ways, though there's a lot of movement back and forth. So I don't want to underplay by any means Turkey's concerns about what's going on. But again, I think Turkey, as everybody else, is kind of fumbling for what kind of leverage they have to exercise in Syria.
Since your speech was entitled Covering the Arab Revolts, I would be interested in your practice as a journalist, actually, because before the revolts, it seems to me at least that writing about the Middle East was very much dominated by a limited, more or less limited group of trusted authorities, researchers or journalists. While now the revolts are also very much about this explosion of expression, of self-expression, people writing about themselves, expressing themselves, etc. The social media and everything that's going on, we sort of have to trust them, although they're not journalists, but somehow we have, because there's no other sources, we have to trust them, especially in Syria and other places which are not really accessible. And I wonder, you mentioned that people actually discover themselves for the first time. And I've just been to Libya where I kind of apologized to a group of people and told them, even in Lebanon, we didn't know much about Libya. And they said, don't worry, we didn't either. we didn't know very much about ourselves. We didn't know anything about our poetry, our forbidden literature, etc. So I wonder whether this kind of also changes your practice as a journalist, having to deal with all these different sources. You have to rely. You said that you talked on the phone to people in Syria. Do you have the feeling that the voices have kind of multiplied, and you have to deal with a different kind of knowledge on the Middle East?
Because you made that one point about not, didn't know about ourselves. That there was two places where I felt, and I know this isn't your question, but that sentiment was so powerfully expressed. And one was in Bayda, in Libya, in the east. And I remember I got there right after Colonel Gaddafi's forces had withdrawn. Another place was in Hama this summer when security forces had withdrawn. It was just so remarkable to see self-determination play out on such a vast tableau in such a short amount of time. And it just was remarkable. I mean, within days, these communities had, risen up to, after decades of dictatorship, had risen up to, govern themselves in such a sophisticated, effective way. I mean, it just reminded me when you said that, because it was such an interesting something to behold. Absolutely, it's become so much more complicated. I think this outpouring of social media, and sometimes it's disorienting, to be completely honest. I spent most of this past decade in Iraq, where it was the opposite. I mean, it was so dangerous a lot of the time, even to get out and do an interview in a store. You felt proud of yourself that you were able to get that done and talk to people. Now it's almost the opposite, being overwhelmed by so much expression and stuff coming your way. It's kind of wading through it, and especially with Syria, because everyone has an interest in Syria, and I don't think we don't think we have a full picture. I was so glad to get in there this summer because I finally felt like I could do my own reporting and talk to my own people and make my own judgments. A lot of the time we're just having to rely on a lot of expertise we have in the Bureau with a lot of contacts, trying to make sense of it all. But I think it's become, I didn't do Twitter until this year, and you can't, or last year, I guess, but you can't do without it as a journalist anymore. I mean, you have to be, where the conversation is happening in a lot of ways. That's where the narratives are being written. That's where, I think in some ways, perceptions are being defined, and it has become a huge part of our job. I don't want to underplay the traditional stuff either. I think that still is a huge, important part, but it is kind of amazing to me when, when I think about how that part has changed.
I have a two-part question. There was a lot of criticism about the way Arab media especially handled the revolutions, especially when it came to Bahrain and the way Al Jazeera handled it, and they kept aside from what was happening. So how do you as a journalist perceive it? Did you feel ever that you have to deal with Bahrain differently than you did with Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, for a fact? And coming to Libya, did you at some point during the events say that we shouldn't call this a revolution anymore? Can you have really a people's revolution when people have tanks and they have heavily armored? So they had all kinds of weapons. They had the support of the NATO. Can you still call that a revolution?
Earlier, and the story that I wrote right after Tripoli fell was that it's a revolution with an asterisk, and I meant that. The word is so imbued with so much meaning that I try to use the word revolt or uprising, because I think those are easier to defend in terms of defining what's happening before us. People disagree with me on that. It's hard for me to say what. It still feels early to me in some ways to really declare these revolutions at this point. It feels like we have a long way to go. Bahrain is a great question to talk about, because I don't think there's any question that Al Jazeera has made a decision on its coverage of Bahrain. I mean, I think Jazeera reflects Qatari foreign policy to a greater degree now than it has in the past. And I think it's scandalous that Bahrain hasn't gotten the attention that other stories have. That said, the New York Times has not covered it as aggressively as it should have. And I have to say, one, it's a logistical thing. I had to sneak in there this summer using a military contractor badge to even get into the country. So after that, I was invited, and it became much easier. But it's not easy to get in there and report. So one, the lesson I think Syria and Bahrain have learned is that it works to keep out journalists. It's very successful in some ways. I very much put Bahrain as part of these Arab revolts, and I think the Bahrainis themselves that were protesting do. And I think I had a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure I'm going to offend someone here, and I don't mean to, but it's just a very interesting conversation, and I'll recount it to you. I was in Sitra, where there's every night. I mean, you go into Sitra, and you could be in homes, you could be anywhere. I mean, it is every night clashing with the police, utterly politicized youth. The walls are completely covered in graffiti. There are barricades everywhere, and they go toe-to-toe with the police every night. I mean, it's again that courage that just blows me away. And I was talking to a couple of these guys, tear gas. You could just, it's everywhere in the air. And I was talking to a couple of these guys, and they told me they were upset. It was very interesting how like the revolts have sometimes turned these sectarian notions upside down. Obviously, they're Shia youth and Sitra, and one of them told me that they were upset at Hezbollah's position vis-a-vis the Syrian revolt because they thought Hezbollah should have supported the Syrian uprising. So at that moment, they had kind of set aside their sectarian affiliation, and they were seeing themselves very much part of these revolts that were going on across the region. And I think Bahrainis do feel that way. I think obviously it's complicated, it's this, it's that, but often that idea that it's complicated is a way to make an excuse of why it's not part of these revolts when I think it is. It's a question of enfranchisement, and that's the bottom line. And that crackdown was devastating. I mean, the cynicism of a government to mobilize one community against another, to keep itself in power, and to destroy the fabric of a society that was actually very cosmopolitan by the Gulf standards is criminal to me, and I'll never understand that. It's so short-sighted, but I guess that's power.
In the American idea of journalism, you're supposed to be objective as a reporter. Do you ever feel the need during all of these revolutions to pick a side, that after all these years of dictatorship and giving voice in the theater of absurd, which is political sound bites, that it's all right to just side with the people when they're rising up?
The idea of objectivity, I think, just doesn't make any sense, and I've never subscribed to it. I think it's such a false notion, and there's this obsession in America, somehow we're, I think it's its own kind of like self-legitimizing myth or whatever, this idea of objectivity. I think you can be fair, and I do try to be fair. I think fairness is important, and I think it's different than objectivity. But more important to me, I guess as a journalist, and I feel this more and more the longer I do this, it's less about fairness or objectivity. It's really about understanding what's going on. And that's the reason I keep doing this, I mean, it's been 15 years now in the Middle East, is that I'm fascinated by these stories because I get to learn, and I get to try to make sense of them. I get to try to understand them on their own terms. And that's what's interesting to me. So when I write a story, it's just trying to make sense of it, trying to understand it. And really, that's kind of how I focus it, or where I put myself. And, in Egypt in February, the one thing to make sense of was why there was 100,000 people in Tahrir Square. So, that's what you tried to understand, and that's where put all the effort and everything. That's the one side. The other side is you can't help but be taken away by these events. I mean, I'll never forget. And when Mubarak fell that night, it was one of the most, I don't know if people were here in the square that night, but the night before, Mubarak had refused to step down. Everybody was demoralized. Anyway, so we're in the square. There was a big crowd in the square that night, and I was talking to a friend, actually, Khalil, who I mentioned, and he gets on the phone, and he says, "What? He did what?" And then you looked across this crowd that went as far as the horizon, and this just kind of rippled through that crowd as Mubarak had fallen, and it was the most euphoric moment I've ever. 8 years of the tragedy of Baghdad just washed away in a moment to see this scene unfold. And I got work. I got choked up. In fact, who it was, an Egyptian came up to me and said, "Shid the halak." So I was a little more taken, back. But anyway, so you can't help it be. I live here. I have roots here. You can't help but be taken by the moment. And if somebody criticizes you for that, I'm just like, you're human in the end. So.
I'm trying to understand this idea of the charismatic state. I know what a charismatic leader is supposed to be, but am I right to hear that you have the idea that this magical moment that you just mentioned, this magical spirit of community somehow would infuse the working of the state machinery and make sure that everything is all right? I find that a very dangerous idea.
Well,
charisma is not accountable. You can't measure it, and we're talking about power, going bounds of power. Charisma would not. I won't feel reassured by charisma against power.
What he meant, and I'll just because I wasn't able to fully put his he was making a contrast to a charismatic leader, that we've had enough of Abdel Nasser, we've had enough of these leaders and their eternal imagery and all this kind of stuff. And I think he was borrowing the phrase charismatic state as a contrast to charismatic leader. Saeed Farjani is an interesting guy. He was elected to parliament with the Nahda party, but he lived 15 years in London. And I mean, I think his idea of a charismatic state, to be honest, is Western parliamentary democracy. I mean, that's what he sees, a system that can, he made the point that, you can have a George Bush in America, and despite what George Bush does, you can have an Obama, or I'm not saying Obama did much better, but you can, the system can heal itself because it's got institutions, it's got a civil society. I mean, I think he's not making a revolutionary notion here. He's just saying that we have to be able to rely on a state that can absorb the failings of an individual leader. I think that was his idea.
It's all very charismatic.
Again, I think he's using the terms of contrast to charismatic leader.
Yes, Anthony, I wanted to ask you, you were here in 2005 during the Beirut demonstrations. How do you see them five years later in the light of what's happening in the region?
Actually, Nadim, I wasn't. I was in Baghdad then, so I missed so it's hard for me to deliver any, because I wasn't part of that moment, and I don't think I can speak with much authority on what that moment represented. I dealt with the aftermath more in some ways, and of course the war in '06 being the aftermath of that. I guess I'm struck, and I think people may disagree with me here on this, but I don't see a lot of. It's interesting to me how divorced I feel that this moment is from Iraq or Lebanon in '05. I don't know. And that's just a gut feeling, kind of an instinctual feeling. I think there probably are connections to be drawn. I'm sure there are connections to be drawn, but it's just so kind of revelatory to me as a journalist how new and different everything feels. It just of a region transformed. I don't think, my own sense on that, I don't think '05 marked a transformation of Lebanon in the way that these events have, but that's my own sense.
I was very, when I used to watch the news and coverage and everything, used to talk about Cairo, and I'm Alexandrian, so I felt betrayed. But otherwise, before the uprising, I was in the US for study abroad. And I was in the cafeteria for most of my meals. I used to remember that Fox News would be on. And they talk about the Arab world in such a bad way, or Islam, or Iraq, or Iran, and how they mix all the countries together. And I remember once that somebody called me from the library to translate a book that was written in Urdu, and he told me it's from the East. And don't you think by now this rhetoric should have changed, how they mix the region with Islam, talk about the Arab world and the Islamic world, and all the confusion that's always on TV, or with people that don't have much knowledge into writing. Don't you think this should have been changed by now by journalists and coverage?
The story, I didn't write this in the end, but the story I wanted to write about the 10-year anniversary of September 11th was after 10 years of an exponential increase in writing about, and for an American audience, an exponential increase in writing about the Arab world, the Middle East, political Islam, all these subjects. Do Americans have a more sophisticated understanding? I don't think they do at all. And I think we're in a moment right now in the United States that's, I find it very troubling and unsettling, to be honest. It's not a good moment in the United States right now in terms of its relationship or how it posits itself with the region, how it views the uprisings. It's basically fear. Right? That's my sense. I mean, I may be wrong on this. It's not just fear, but I think there's this real kind of lingering sense of here come the Islamists, here come, with not understanding the grades of, not understanding the diversity that term implies. It's tough as a reporter. You're always fighting, you can think whatever you want, but you're in the end, you're going to have to deal with editors, and you're going to have to deal with readers, and it's a perpetual conflict. And I see you're always fighting the good fight, and I think you are. I mean, it's, and it's, and I think we're part to blame for that, but we're also, I think there, I'm not sure what the alternative is. So, but I agree with you on that. I don't think that, we have not done that good a job. And that's a great point, I think, when you can make just what you said about Alexandria. What about Alexandria? There was an army of us in Cairo, and we never got to the Sinai. We never got to Alexandria. We never went to the Said. Missing that sense of revolution being in Cairo, I think that's a really good criticism of how it was covered, because amazing events were going on, especially in the Sinai and Alexandria, that just were not covered, or they're not part of the public record in some ways, or whatever.
Can I ask you, since you work for a news organization that's located close to Wall Street, and some commentators have comment on some sort of comparison between the Arab Spring and what goes on with organizing Wall Street? If there's any legitimacy to this comparison, what differences or what similarities might be?
That's a great question. To be honest, I'm not going to be able to offer anything insightful on that. I think it's interesting. It's hard, especially I was at a conference in Istanbul recently, speaking to a lot of Islamists, and it was interesting to me that sense of like paradigms, crumbling of the space for new ideologies to emerge, the sense of failure of old institutions. I mean, I was so struck by that sense that they had of this moment and what this moment represents. I think there is something that crosses borders and that's something that is interconnected, but I don't have enough, I just haven't dealt with it enough to say anything, that's very insightful on that. Sorry.
Robert Fisk has been actually very critical about the events in Syria and actually has been writing a lot. And in most of his articles, he's been actually, I wouldn't say daring, but maybe going against the mainstream approaches that have been interpreting the events in Syria. And he actually states that, in fact, the majority, within brackets, has been moreover lenient towards supporting the regime than it is actually to go against it. Now, to what extent, and he's been actually writing about the actual intervention of arms smuggling, in addition to political pressure, diplomats from, ex-Ba'athist Syrian officials who have actually defected and so on and so forth, and how they've actually been asking for cells to be created just like Benghazi in order for them to effectuate a rebellion by, for example, deploying a new central bank and so on, parallel government, so to speak. The question is, to what extent do you think that the events in Syria have been more about geopolitics than they are about actually a humanitarian aspect of what is happening? Turkey, who still denies, or at least does not want to recognize any genocide that has happened, is talking about human rights. And Saudi Arabia, they stone people.
There's absolutely an amazing amount of hypocrisy. There always is in politics.
Who is actually raising the banner of humanitarian and democracy? Is it Saudi Arabia?
Syria. My sense of it, I think no one would have done anything if this didn't erupt in Derna in March. I think there is no one's going to deny that Syria is at a pivotal geopolitical point in this region, and that the stakes are far higher there than they were even in Libya, not Egypt, but in Libya certainly. Now I haven't read Fisk on this, and Fisk is at the same place we all are, trying to make sense of it from abroad. I don't think he has any special authority on this. I think Fisk is a great reporter. I think we're all trying to make sense of something that's very confusing right now. My sense, first and foremost, and this is just, for my trips into homes in Hama, from the reporting, like I said, we have a terrific bureau here in Beirut, and I feel that I can absolutely trust the reporting that goes on there, is that this is an uprising, whether it has the majority or not. I tend to think it does have the majority. I might be wrong on that. It is taking, I think, increasingly an armed dimension. I think there are foreign powers both foreign powers and the government in Damascus that want to take it in that direction. Where it goes from here, I think, is scary, to be honest, and I don't know where it goes. My own sense on one thing that I felt different in June in Hama and what's going on in Homs right now is that in Hama, I felt that there was still, the city had absolutely risen up and it was starting to govern itself. But there was from what I could make sense of in the reporting there was a good portion of the business elite that had not signed on. And there was some kind of resentment at the youth that had tried to kind of commandeer the city in some ways. There was this kind of older leadership that had grown up, but there was also the youth vying for power, and the youth were in the streets all the time, protesting 3 or 4 times a night just because they could protest. I feel like Homs has become something different than that, and I feel like the majority in Homs, and again, I hate to put it in sectarian terms, but I think the Sunni majority in Homs is utterly behind the revolt at this point, and I think that is both And it's both interesting and scary, because I'm not sure where it heads from there. But as this violence goes on, it's going to get more dangerous, and more tragic, to be honest.
Any more? Last question?
Sorry. I have two small questions on Iran. I would like to know your view on current U.S. Statements on Iran, whether it's the so-called plot against the Saudi ambassador or ideas to bomb Iran after the IAEA report. And second of all, do you think that any revolution will be knocking on Iran's doors anytime soon?
I tell you, the worst thing journalists do is act like they know more than they actually do, and I just do not. I don't cover Iran, so I'm not going to be able to offer. Again, I hate to do this. I'm not trying to cop out. I just don't. I don't cover it, and I really can't say anything that would be all that helpful. So I'm sorry. I apologize.
Can I just ask one last question? A lot of people have been struggling with what to call what's going on, and I'm wondering, at some point, are we just going to call it 2010, 2011, like 1968?
That's funny. No wonder.
Because there's so many things going on that aren't part of, they're part of something, but they're connected by a web or a network, it's not one process.
Yeah, that's a great point. I never thought about that, but I wonder if we don't count it by the year now. I mean, Arab Spring never sat well with me just because it's so bloody. I use the word Arab revolts, or Arab revolutions and revolts. I try to put it that way sometimes. But I think you're right. I think it is going to become, because there's so many different dynamics have been set into motion at this point that they're going to be reverberating for years and maybe even decades, that a year in some ways is probably a better shorthand than anything else.
Maybe it'll be 2010, 2011,
Exactly.
2012.
That's right.
Okay. I want to thank you for coming
My
out
pleasure.
and speaking to us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.